Throughout our time on this channel, we've shared many stories of many notorious storms, from the 1913 blizzard to the Black Friday storm or Lake Erie's perfect storm, even to the Armistice Day blizzard of 1940 that wreaked havoc all across Lake Michigan. However, there is one infamous storm we have yet to cover, and the ship in which it was named after: the SS Mataafa. This storm was the worst storm ever to hit Lake Superior from November 27th to the 28th of 1905. The storm system moved across the Great Basin with moderate depth. This was on November 26th and November 27th. However, then, an east-northeastward across the Great Lakes on November 28th is when the storm shifted. New east winds were forecasted for the afternoon and evening of November 27th. There were storm warnings in effect by the morning of November 28th. These winds and gusts, along with heavy snows, turned into a cyclone. The storm, named after the steamship Mataafa, destroyed or damaged over 20 to 30 vessels, and she claimed over 36 lives. This cost shipping businesses a loss of around $3 to $5 million in 1905 on Lake Superior. The SS Mataafa was built in 1899, originally as the SS Pennsylvania. She was built by the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company. The Mataafa had a length of 430 feet. She had a beam of 50 feet, a depth of 25 feet, and, like most other ships on the Great Lakes, her hull was made of large steel plates. When the Mataafa was first built, she was actually leased out as the SS Pennsylvania for a couple months. However, she was quickly sold to the Minnesota Steamship Company, which then renamed her to the SS Mataafa, as we know her. The Mataafa did not have a clean run in her first season. She actually struck a rock in the Straits of Mackinac, and when she arrived in Chicago, Illinois, she had a leak. Soon after, she then ran aground above the Sioux Locks on her way back to Minnesota. In 1901, the Mataafa became a part of the original Pittsburgh Steamship Division of U.S. Steel. This was when the division was formed. However, because of fog, the Mataafa again ran aground, this time on Knife Island Reef in Lake Superior on June 2nd, 1902. On the morning of November 27, 1905, the weather forecast called for cold and fair conditions out on Lake Superior. At the port in Duluth, Minnesota, the Mataafa was getting ready to set sail with its cargo of iron ore. She would also be towing with her the barge James Nasmith. In the command of the Mataafa was Captain Richard F. Humble. Captain Richard had spent over 16 years sailing across the Great Lakes. This gave him a great sense of confidence in his navigation and experience in shipping across them. At around 3:30 p.m., the Mataafa cleared the Duluth Harbor piers with the barge James Nasmith behind her. Both of these vessels were fully loaded again with iron ore and headed for the steel plants along Lake Erie. The weather began to worsen as winds began to gust with some snow and flurries mixed in. Captain Richard had some reservations about the weather as it began to grow. However, the Mataafa was still considered young and she had already weathered many storms throughout the 6 years prior in her service. The Mataafa and Nasmith made good progress as they set out. However, again, the weather conditions began to get even worse and deteriorated throughout the evening. The gusts of wind and snow had turned into a raging blizzard finally, and waves began to crash over the spar deck, swirling down the length of the vessel, Mataafa. Captain Richard began to have great concern, however, at this point for his vessel, and with good reason, for what was before him. By 7:30 p.m., both the Mataafa and the Nasmith were off Two Harbors, Minnesota, when all of a sudden the storm's full force struck both of the vessels. Giant waves began to crash over the pilot house, and the already limited visibility got even worse. The temperature dropped to nearly zero, and the crewmen down below began to struggle to stay on their feet. The firemen in the engine room began to shovel coal into the boilers while the chief engineer throttled the engine as the screw was lifted and fell back into the rolling waves. Come November 28th, in the morning, the Mataafa was still being destroyed by the storm as it had not let up yet. Although the Mataafa put up a good headway for over 10 hours, both vessels had made little to no progress. Captain Richard finally made the order for the vessels to head back to the shelter of Duluth. This maneuver would, however, require the Mataafa to fall into the trough of the waves and then swing her bow around. But with a good turnout, the Mataafa successfully completed the maneuver and then made their way back towards Duluth. Over the next several hours, the Mataafa and the Nasmith inched their way along towards the North Shore. As the Mataafa and the Nasmith made their way back to Duluth, they were actually able to see the shoreline as the snowfall let up a little. Captain Richard caught sight of two vessels entering the harbor. The vessels were the steamer R.W. England and the steamer Isaac L. Elwood. The England had approached the Duluth ship canal when her captain realized that the England was not going to make the piers. The steamer attempted to make her way back into Lake Superior, but the giant waves from the storm pushed the England ashore. The England eventually crashed ashore and ended up high on the beach. The crewmen aboard the England were safe, however, the vessel not so much. The Isaac L. Elwood also made her attempt to enter the ship canal. The Elwood reached the safety of the canal at around 1 p.m. and headed directly through the two piers. However, again, a massive wave sent the Elwood crashing into the North Pier, tearing off her hull plates. The Elwood then bounced off the pier into the other south end pier, causing more damage to her hull. But she fought through it and continued onwards just inside the harbor. A crowd had gathered, and the spectators nearby began to cheer as the vessel made her way through. She pulled into shallow waters by the tugs, and then the Elwood quickly settled to the bottom. However, her crew was unharmed and safe. The Mataafa and the Nasmith both reached the entrance to the ship canal then at 2:15 p.m. However, because of the raging blizzard, it was determined to be nearly impossible to bring both the Mataafa and the Nasmith through the narrow ship canal as well, seeing as the previous two vessels barely even made it through themselves. Captain Richard gave an order for the tow line to be cut just a few miles before the harbor entry of the two piers. The barge line between the Mataafa and the Nasmith was cut. However, thankfully, the anchors held and the Nasmith rode out the remainder of the storm. After this, Captain Richard then made the order for the Mataafa to go full steam ahead towards the entry of the two piers. As the Mataafa made her way towards the piers, a giant wave lifted the vessel so high into the air that the bow of the Mataafa struck the bottom. The blow from this incredible wave sent the vessel's stern careening into the North Pier. And then, before she had any time to recover, another wave forced the Mataafa to turn perpendicular to the other pier, the south pier. Even though the Mataafa still had full power and was trying to make her way ahead, it was completely immobilized. Captain Richard then realized that her rudder had been sheared off when the vessel struck the pier. The Mataafa was now completely immobile and at the mercy of the raging storm outside. Wave after wave began to punish her, and the steamer was thrown against the concrete pier until, yet again, another massive wave pushed the steamer outside the pier into the nearby shallow water. It was at this point that Captain Richard's gamble that he had thought to himself of entering the ship canal had gone completely and utterly wrong. After the Mataafa struck hard aground, she began to break in two because of the storm. Her stern section began to settle lower into the water, and as waves washed over the sinking stern section, it extinguished her boiler. This was the only source of heat and power on the vessel. Temperatures outside were nearly 13 below zero, and the stern was breaking apart rapidly. The crewmen in the aft section were in bad shape. The second mate, who had been aft to help with releasing the tow line from the Nasmyth earlier, decided to risk crossing the open deck to the forward section of the Mataafa. The second mate, along with 3 other crewmen, made their way along the railing. This while icy waves crashed over them, nearly breaking their grasp on the thin wire railing they were holding onto. However, the 3 men fought and reached forward. One crew member, after nearly being washed overboard into Lake Superior several times, finally made the decision to join the other 8 crewmen on the stern section. These crew members had little protection from the horrible elements of the blizzard outside. As the wind gusts began to rage over 60 miles an hour, the 9 sailors sought refuge under the smokestack. The remaining 15 crew members took refuge in the forepeak. However, the conditions where these crew members took shelter at were little better than at the stern, as the water was still crashing overboard through broken portholes and through broken doors of the Mataafa. The crewmen had only one source of heat from a few lamps that they were able to find. There was no food, so some of the men broke off icicles and began to suck on them for water. Captain Richard ordered the men to stay on their feet, even though they were all completely exhausted from the storm and battling its conditions. However, there seemed to be some light at the end of the tunnel of this terrible storm. The crewmen on the Mataafa were able to see bonfires which were blazing along the shore through the snowstorm. They did not know that nearly 40,000 people from Duluth had gathered along the piers and beaches and were watching as the event unfolded. The Coast Guard had made an attempt to get a line to the Mataafa and rig a breeches buoy, but the line quickly froze and snapped. No lifeboats were lowered, or any other attempts for that matter were made as the storm still raged on Lake Superior. The crew of the Mataafa sat tight. In the early morning hours of November 29th, there was better weather finally as the storm began to break. The wind and seas had decreased greatly, and this allowed the Coast Guard to launch their boat out to the broken vessel. Captain Richard and the other crewmen in the forward section were quickly taken off. Before Captain Richard himself got off the Mataafa, he made his way to the back section of the stern. As he approached, he was met with a horrific sight. Several aft crewmen were froze to death. These crew members' bodies were encased by ice and had to be chopped free to be taken off the Mataafa. In total, 9 crew members in the stern section of the broken vessel died of exposure or were washed overboard. The barge, James Nasmyth, was towed into port, although she was very much battered from the storm throughout the night. All of the crew on the vessel, however, survived. Even though the Mataafa was broken in two and was severely damaged from the storm, the steamer was eventually recovered some 6 months later after the event. In 1906, the vessel was rebuilt at the cost of nearly $100,000, but she resumed a very long and successful career on the Great Lakes after this. In 1958, the Nicholson Transit Company then purchased the Mataafa. They would then go on to fit out the 60-year-old steamer into service as an automobile carrier to carry 500 vehicles from Detroit to Buffalo en route. The Mataafa exchanged hands several times before being purchased by the Marine Salvage Company in 1965. In that same year, the Mataafa passed down the Welland Canal under her own power for the very last time. And finally, to close the story on the Mataafa, on July 19, 1965, the vessel arrived at Hamburg, Germany, and it was here that she was to be scrapped at the shipbreakers. And that is the full story of the tragic SS Mataafa ship, or dubbed from the storm, the Mataafa Storm on Lake Superior. Wow, what a wild ride that must have been that night for those poor men to weather a terrible freezing blizzard out there. I mean, I have to think that they had some hope being so close to shore, although on the other hand, there was absolutely no way that they could make it out to the piers, and thank goodness for those 40,000 people that were probably, as it says, they were cheering them on, to stay alive, and lighting all the bonfires. I'm sure that had to have given them hope, and the 15 in the front, they survived, but those poor 9 crew members in the rear section, that's what a tragedy. They had no source of heat. It sucks that they had no source of heat, no food, and only ice to try and get a source of water from to just make it through the night. Oh, my heart goes out to them. But it's been a while, or it's been a long time coming, that I knew I was going to eventually get to the Mataafa storm ship and talk about her and this very lengthy tragedy. I am thankful that there's plenty to go off of here, and to give these 9 souls their very much due respect, and may they never be forgotten, and may they be at peace as well. God bless them. But this will not be the only time I bring up the Mataafa storm, as there are other vessels as well that did not make it on that terrible night. Those 2 nights, make it through that terrible night storm and into the day. But tell me what you guys think in the comment section down below. I'm kind of brain scrambled right now because that was such a wild ride going through this and reading and learning all these events, and kind of the events played out in my head. And man, what a thing, what a tragedy. That's why this channel's here again, guys. I say it like this all the time. These ship stories will never be forgotten, but I'm just rambling now. I thank you all so very much again for your support. Let me know what you thought in the comments down below. Any corrections, additional information, any of that good stuff. And I will catch you again next time on Songs of the Great Lakes. Until then, God bless you all.